Thanks, everyone, and great to join. What I was going to talk about today is effectively global spaceport development and how the industry has changed. And I think important to see what, in terms of working out where we're going, it's great to sort of take a little bit of time to see where we've come from, because I think that gives us an appreciation. For me personally, as a relative newcomer to the space industry, I've just clocked up 12 months now with Equatorial Launch Australia. And it's been a major learning curve for me, clearly, in terms of appreciating the technical challenges of this industry and all the hurdles which its participants have had to overcome, and the complexities of getting a vehicle into space and actually putting a payload and keeping it there. So I certainly have all the more respect for the sort of pioneers of the space industry, which, if you go back and realize that the first satellite was actually put into orbit back in 1957, so 65 years ago. And since then, we've had almost 6,000 successful launches over that time. So whilst it's not surprising that in 2002, last year, it clearly was a record year for launch with 179 launches. That was up 20% on the record, which was set only a year prior in 2021. But what is surprising is that whilst it is still pretty incredible when you think about it, that a single company, SpaceX, has launched more than 1/3 of those 179 successful launches with 61. If you go back in time and look at history, Roscosmos out of I guess the old USSR, they actually peaked at 102 launches in 1982, with clearly a much older technology 40 years ago than what was available today. So that history tells us that perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, and that it has been done before, that SpaceX this year will be getting closer to 80 launches, and that's just by itself. So clearly the number of launches which is going, which will continue to grow as the industry evolves and develops. So if we look at where we are today, we're March 17th, SpaceX has launched 17 rockets already. So that's a rate of a successful launch rate of one every 4.5 days, which is still it's still, when you sit back and realize the complexity of what they're doing, it is a pretty remarkable feat. So clearly, aligned with that, the dynamics of the launch market have changed since the 1960s, thankfully. And whilst the physics and the rocket equation still really largely dictates the amount of payload that you can get into space through the size of the rocket, the past decade or so has really seen a seismic change in the development of new commercial launch vehicles to meet the needs of a growing, small satellite market. And clearly that cost of access to space is the real catalyst here. And if we turn our attention now from the actual launch vehicles to the spaceports, we can see that those requirements and that evolution is changing as well. Because clearly, if we go back several decades, the amount of infrastructure that was required to launch a vehicle the size of Orion 5 or going back further, Saturn 5, you would require a multi-story vertical assembly building, solid fuel manufacturing facilities on site, a launch pad with a safety radius several miles in diameter. And indeed, if we look at some of the more recent commercial launch companies, some such as Astra, their entire go-to-market approach has advertised that they really just need a concrete pad, and they're bringing everything else in the form of 40-foot containers with mobile control centers and mission control centers. Now that's clearly, and whilst there are still some complexities of that, which I'll delve into later, that's quite a far cry from the days back when NASA was launching the Saturn V, and you can see the image there on the top right of the screen. The transporter crawler, which I was fortunate to see when I visited the Kennedy Space Center last year, that transporter crawler, which was the vehicle on which the large launch vehicle was actually moving between the integration facility and the actual launch pad, that today, if it was rebuilt, would alone cost $129 million US. It has 8 tracks, and each of those tracks has 57 shoes or cleats, and each of those cleats weighs 900 kilograms alone. So the complexity and the requirements of the launch facility have changed significantly, and definitely for the better. Again, looking at history, spaceports have traditionally been government-owned and fully operated programs. It was really part of an integrated space solution where there was a government entity like NASA, and it ran the space program end to end. So each major spacefaring nation effectively would have their flagship launch sites, and all launches would be conducted from there. So whether it was Cape Canaveral or, in the US, or Baikonur in Kazakhstan for the USSR at the time, Sriharikota in India, and so forth, and even Kourou in French Guiana, which was originally the French site prior to it being superseded by the European Space Agency. And really, this was a purely closed loop until the 1970s, where defense contractors like McDonnell Douglas and General Dynamics started building launch vehicles. But these would still effectively be contracted by NASA, and the operations would be conducted by NASA as well. So there wasn't a lot of external input into the space industry. But now, clearly, the times are changing, and that's positive for all participants involved. Clearly, SpaceX has been a pioneer in many respects in terms of leading the way of commercial development of the space industry, particularly when it comes to launch. And that was really the redevelopment of Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center was really significant. And whilst it was a little bit sad, I guess, for historians, given that the launch complex was really the same one that was designed for the Saturn V and later the space shuttle missions, clearly the existing infrastructure that they had around Kennedy Space Center meant that it was an ideal site for what SpaceX and the team were trying to do there. So that was their launch operations really started in 2017 there, and that launch frequency is now ramped up to 17 in 2022 of a single pad. And clearly, with the amount of launches that SpaceX has had to do, that they have then had to expand into other centers such as Cape Canaveral, just south of Kennedy, Vandenberg Space Force on the west coast, and clearly they're actually now looking at building up their own facilities, not only for Falcon 9 but for Starship as well. What we have seen as well is the operators of these traditional government complexes like NASA and ESA are now finding ways in which they can reinvigorate and refurbish some of the old pads, and have really awarded, the more recent announcements seeing that 4 of the old pads at Cape Canaveral Space Force Base have been allocated to commercial companies in the likes of ABL Systems, Phantom, Stoke, and Via Space. So, and a similar thing is happening in Europe, where Canes is converting the old Diamant launch complex that was last used in 1978, and that is effectively being they're looking to build out a multi-user launch pad there for the next generation of European commercial space launches. It is interesting to an external observer like myself that the opening of these facilities still seems to be very much along national or regional lines, and it seems very unlikely that if you are a US commercial launch company, for example, that you're easily going to get access to Kourou in French Guiana, or conversely, if you're a European launcher, it does seem quite challenging that you'd be able to launch out of some of those government sites in the US. So whilst the nationalism, if you like, has dissipated a little bit in terms of the space programs, clearly there is still very much a vested interest in promoting European space launch, for example, from ESA and the success of the US launches out of NASA. But this opportunity, and I put it in inverted commas, does come with a few caveats for particularly some of these new launch companies. And I don't think that necessarily getting into some of these historic launch complexes is going to prove to be a panacea for launch operations. And I'll tell you why. For starters, there are quite significant refurbishment costs in actually taking these pads and refurbishing them and getting them up to a standard that is required for modern launch operations. In the Diamant complex case in French Guiana, for example, the facilities there haven't been used for more than 40 years. And so there's really, whilst it's great to have the infrastructure there, that infrastructure may not be fit for purpose. And as we saw in the case of Launch Complex 39A, you might end up bulldozing the entire thing and starting again, really just capitalizing on the piece of land and where it is. So clearly there will be some challenges there, and the facilities or the layout of the site may not be ideal in terms of what a modern commercial launch provider is looking for today. The other harsh realities with some of these launch complexes, particularly in the US, is that they're already busy. And yes, there is the infrastructure of being at a complex like Kennedy Space Center, but for smaller launch companies finding their way, that actually may more than be counterbalanced by the fact that launch windows might not be as flexible as elsewhere. You've got the famous or the infamous Cape weather, and of course the growing air traffic restrictions around those facilities. The coast of Orlando is an extremely busy air traffic environment. It's not getting any quieter. And particularly as we see the likes of the incumbents like SpaceX and even NASA picking up their launch cadence, newer, smaller commercial launch companies might not enjoy the flexibility that they require at this stage of their rocket development. We've seen certainly, particularly for earlier launches in a company's evolution, scrubs are a pretty common occurrence, and even in complexes today like Wallops in Virginia, we've seen when there've been decisions made and the correct decisions made by the likes of Rocket Lab to delay their launch, the next launch window might only be a couple of weeks later due to some of those air traffic restrictions. And going forwards, I can see this being an issue whereby trying to slot in and around other launches on site will become an increasing challenge. There is clearly the risk as well with multi-user launch pads that, again, you will get a very finite piece of time in which to conduct your launch window, and the next available spot might only be several weeks away, depending on how backed up and how booked out that particular multi-user pad might be. So clearly some other launches have gone down the path of not using some of those facilities and building their own. And clearly that this is in some respects taking a leaf out of the old government playbooks and effectively vertically integrating themselves. And probably the prime case study for this was Rocket Lab. It was a New Zealand formed company, and they built out the Mahia Spaceport complex in New Zealand in 2016, and became the first private spaceport to host an orbital launch. So building your own spaceport clearly does give you the advantage of setting up everything just the way you like it. There's clearly no one else around, so there's a lot more flexibility around launch. There's opportunities if you wish to build your manufacturing and your engine test facilities on site, so you've got everything there and you've got your entire team there. But again, there are drawbacks to this approach. For starters, spaceports are extremely capital expensive, and the cost of a fully fledged spaceport can run into the tens of millions of dollars and effectively represent a major project in their own right. Clearly, and the more challenging piece are the regulations around launch facilities and launch facility licensing, which can be pretty onerous. You've got the geography, and in order for, and we'll talk about the sort of properties of spaceports fairly soon, but the finding a site that you can acquire in the first place, and one that ticks all the boxes in terms of having stable weather, not having too many concerns in the form of air or maritime traffic, being pretty remote, depending on what inclinations or direction or azimuths you're looking to fire in, and things like engagement with the community. Not all communities are embracing the fact that you might be wanting to launch rockets not that far from where they live, given some of the history of the industry and the learnings of of failed launches and accidents. So I think it also challenges those launch companies in terms of prioritization. Where do you allocate the capital to? Do you allocate that to the spaceport, or how do you divide your management time, very precious management time at that, between the development of the spaceport and the development of the rocket itself? And of course, any delays in the spaceport construction or delays with the environmental or regulatory approval process can also delay the timelines in getting the launch vehicle into orbit and starting to generate revenue, not only for yourself but for the payload customers that you are launching on behalf of. So this is really and then finally there's the question of scale, and having this dedicated launch and operations team that needs to be stood up and the costs that go with that, that needs to be justified against the amount of launch frequencies that you'll be able to have to make sure that you get the requisite scale to actually get the most out of that facility. Clearly with these facilities, they are not multi-user complexes. They are license specific for that particular operator. And so, there isn't really the opportunity to spread that cost amongst external customers. And so really, when you're looking at that site, those sites, and Mahira is a prime example where it is very good for certain inclinations, but less effective for others, and that can clearly impact the payload if a customer is looking to go into a different inclination. So that brings us to the latest evolution in spaceports, and that's private spaceports. Now, in this private spaceports, I'll also include sort of public to private spaceports as well, where we have seen some legacy government spaceport facilities which have become more commercial. But the real focus here, I guess, is more on greenfield sites, which I'd like to talk about, because we are seeing that evolution of the industry. So commercial spaceports or private spaceports, which are privately owned and funded, are typically have facilities that have been chosen based on some of those core requirements of a successful spaceport that I spoke about earlier. They need to be fairly remote or have proximity to large unpopulated areas from over which clearly the rockets can fly. But contrasting with that, they need to have a nearby infrastructure, such as a port or an airport, ideally both, and national roads to transport those launch vehicles and other peripherals to get to the site. Need to be in the right geography, and clearly, even if you go back as to the genesis of why Cape Canaveral and Kennedy were chosen as spaceports where they were, that was pretty much as close as the US could get to the equator. So getting close to the equator where you can for most launches is clearly important. Less so for polar orbits, of course. But again, when you look at the geography of the world and where you can launch, there's not hundreds of sites from which you can choose from. So that's really important. The other key thing here really is that there seems to be a move away, particularly from the private spaceport sector, of the legacy government approach, which is here's a piece of land or a pad, and you, the rocket company, need to do absolutely everything. We are seeing a more change to commercial spaceports offering more of a turnkey solution, whereby there would be the opportunity to provide ancillary services such as mission management or launch-related services, assistance with obtaining launch application permits and so forth. And that really allows the launch vehicle customer to focus on their rockets and their payload customer, and takes away the effort associated with building that infrastructure, which is not necessarily a core activity. And interestingly, although having said that and spoken about multi-user pads, and clearly one of the core premises of these commercial spaceports is that there are these multi-user pads, so that those customers who want to come in can integrate into the existing facilities. Certainly the feedback that we seem to be getting from our discussions with customers is a strong preference for dedicated launch pads and assembly facilities. So even though it might be in a multi-user spaceport, the idea and the notion of dedicated pads and launch precincts is still a very popular one. And I think that goes back to the sort of the key points and the benefits of those who have built their own spaceports around having the flexibility and the ability to do what they want to do within a defined geography. So a commercial spaceport really can provide the ideal world of having dedicated facilities for a commercial launch customer, but not necessarily requiring that customer to spend all the capital expenditure that they would have to if they were doing it themselves. And particularly when it comes to the supporting activities around range clearance and radar and telemetry, really only paying for that core infrastructure when you actually need to use it. So if we take a quick look at the global map, and this is really quite interesting in terms of we are seeing an explosion, if you like, in the developments and certainly the claims of new commercial spaceports coming around. To date, there is still fairly limited active operating commercial spaceports. The Arnhem Space Centre down in Australia is one of them. Australia has actually really emerged, if you like, in terms of commercial spaceports, as well as Wave Complex down in South Australia as well, operated by Southern Launch. But we are seeing an increasing number. There's been a lot of development in Scandinavia with the Andøya Spaceport, Sweden as well. Kiruna is by Swedish Space Corporation. They have a pad which is available for use. And we've seen even now listed entities like Maritime Launch Services out of Canada who are building theirs out. It is interesting that despite some of the challenges of operating a spaceport, and by that I mean the onerous regulatory approval process that you have to go through, the complexity of those environmental approvals, we are seeing a lot of talk about new spaceports and emerging every day, and that's really interesting, just given the challenges of that. I don't think, in the same way that we look at commercial launch vehicle companies and see that there are probably around 70 launch vehicle companies at the moment trying to develop a rocket which will take a payload into space of up to 2,500 kilos. The reality is we think only 10 or 15 of those will have sustainability. I think it will be quite similar on the spaceport front, where there will be a limited number of commercial spaceports that will complement the traditional government-owned spaceports, simply because you need a minimum frequency in these spaceports to make them viable. So in conclusion, and conscious of time, it is great to see that there has been a significant amount of development in the space industry, and that's really a good news story for emerging commercial launch companies who now have a choice of spaceports to operate from, and the ability to really focus their spend and their energies on what they're really good at, which is getting payloads into space. So we certainly will see more spaceports emerge. I think we'll see only a few of these spaceports be sustained, and that's really, I think, a decision for the launch vehicle companies to figure out who are the right partners to partner up with, who are the ones with the right level of expertise. And I think in the same way that Heritage plays an important role in satellite customers looking at making a decision around which rocket company they're going to use, Heritage will be an increasingly important role of the spaceports as well. Thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.
Perfect, Russell, thank you. So let me ask you one question from my side, if you don't mind. So as someone with an extensive experience in commercial and finance industries, what advice would you give to entrepreneurs and investors who are interested in entering the spaceport market, and what are some of the most important factors to consider when evaluating this spaceport project?
Yeah, it's a great question, and look, I think over time the spaceport industry will emerge to be a really interesting asset class for infrastructure investors in the same way that airports and railroads and tollways have, because ultimately once a solid customer base emerges, there is a relatively high predictability around the occurrence. It is the type of asset class that requires a lot of upfront capital investment, but once the site is up and operating, there can be pretty good operating margins, because there's a large capital recovery component in the fees that are charged. So I do think it is a really interesting future or current and future investment space. But clearly the challenges to investors is understanding which of these spaceports have the best probability of success longer term, whether it's geography or existing contract base, and making sure that there aren't those environmental issues that could trip up the spaceport over time. So making sure that you've got a really supportive regulatory and community environments is critical too.